I have not been back home in 20 years. Growing up for most of my life outside of where I was born, I felt disconnected from my roots. Struggling to assimilate into new places while growing more distant from my nationality, I've dealt with my fair share of identity crises as an immigrant. Now that I'm in my mid-20s, I thought it was finally time for me to return home. So come with me as I tell you about my story, being away from my home for 20 years. Until now. At 5, my family and I moved from Japan to Costa Rica. We basically left our extended family to start a new life. In the years I spent growing up in Costa Rica and the US, I had limited connection to my nationality, since there aren't many Japanese people in Costa Rica nor in the southern part of the US. But my family and I made the most out of it. We would make lots of sweets from back home. My parents would speak to my brothers and me in Japanese, and my brothers and I would play Nintendo games. Anime also had a huge influence in keeping me tied to Japanese culture. I loved watching anime set in school growing up because it gave me a glimpse of what life might have looked like if I had not moved. As an immigrant in a low-income family, I never got the chance to go back to Japan, but in the back of my mind, I've always wanted to go. On top of that, my parents, for as long as me, had not gone back home. Their obligations were set on raising my brothers and me, working long hours and spending their free time preparing our meals. One of my worst fears was for my parents to never see my grandparents again, so growing up, I've always wanted to see my parents go back. Being able to travel abroad, although common, was not something we could readily afford. My Instagram feed is filled with travel influencers often going to Japan, and it has made me a little jealous. But now that my parents and I have worked and saved enough money, we can finally get to go back home. Helen and I packed our stuff and left for the trip. Landing in Japan was surreal. Hearing the language that my parents speak and seeing people who look like me felt unnatural, yet comforting. I wasn't used to this feeling since I would often be the only Japanese person in a classroom. I started noticing myself reflecting on my past whenever I would see things that might seem insignificant or normal in Japan. The first few days were spent taking in what Japan had to offer. I wanted to absorb every little thing I saw. Cubic cars dominated the narrow streets. Salarymen roamed in the early morning. Cherry blossoms decorated the walkways. One thing I was especially excited about were the trains. When I was very little, I was obsessed with trains, and I had my own collection of Toei Shinkansens and Thomas the Tank Engine. Riding the Skyliner, JR, and the subways, I was not only thrilled to see life-size versions of the trains I would play with, but impressed by the cleanliness of the stations, the warm seats, and the order people got on and off the trains. Taking the trains, we would typically make our way towards some food. Walking around the streets, the sight of every Japanese food imaginable lined up next to each other made me reflect on how I grew up with my culture's food. Growing up in the US, I often hid the food my mom would make for me from my classmates. In the mornings, I would try to gobble my mom's 6 a.m. onigiri because I didn't want to take them to school and pull them out in class. I didn't want to take packed bento boxes for lunch because I was scared of being judged by the smell of my food. I'd been embarrassed about the food I grew up on, but I know deep down, I loved the food that my mom spent hours cooking. I feel like I never really got to express my gratitude for my parents' love through food because of my rejection of it. Yet, part of growing up and maturing is understanding to appreciate the things that made me different from others culturally. Since graduating from college and being independent, I began cooking more Japanese food and enjoying it. But I did not feel so connected to my culture until I got to eat food in Japan. Since coming here, the onigiri that I used to hide was being sold at a restaurant nearby. The bento boxes I didn't want to bring to school were the most common foods I saw being sold at konbinis. Ramen, teishoku, and sushi being so readily accessible felt like it was healing the childhood version of myself that was too afraid to be culturally different at school. The trains, food, it was all great. But the longer I stayed, not everything in Japan was as nice and cheery as it seemed. Kuki o yome, a concept that is now very well known to even foreigners, which is the Japanese equivalent of saying, read the room. Basically meaning you need to be aware of how you should act in the eyes of those around you. Don't get me wrong, respecting other space and being aware of how your actions may affect others is overall a good thing. But the way that it's enforced is suffocating. People stare at you or treat you differently without saying anything. The politeness of not wanting to make a scene has fed into this behavior of shaming people into cultural norms. The way I grew up in the US was to be more vocal about your feelings, which may sometimes lead to arguments, but at least you know what angered or upset someone, instead of continuously playing a guessing game of whether you're assimilating into the culture well enough or not. Also, more often than not, I would be treated as a foreigner in the country I grew up in. Clothing shop employees would try to help me in Chinese, even though I wasn't Chinese. When I would walk into a restaurant, for some reason, the waiter would know to give me an English menu without me having to speak a word. I felt like I had to convince others that I was Japanese too. In the midst of the discomfort, I felt part of me wanting to go back to the US. I felt like I didn't belong here, the place where I was born. I wrestled with these internal feelings, but these thoughts dissipated the moment I visited some people who made me feel welcome. For most of my time in Japan, I grew up near Tokyo with my parents and one of my grandmas. I still have some memories from back then, like my tiny 5-year-old hands grabbing Pokemon bread from the supermarket nearby, or picking up cicada shells from trees in the neighborhood. The last time I saw my grandma was through a phone screen either on Skype or Line, so I was more than excited to visit her. Planning to visit my grandma, we met up with my dad at the train station where he picked us up in a van. Through the narrow streets and passing by the old kindergarten I attended, I felt nostalgic realizing that this is where I had grown up. We arrived at my grandma's. For the first time in 20 years, I was finally home. The space was a little smaller than I remembered, probably because everything looked bigger as a toddler. Walking around the rooms, I tried to identify everything I recognized, from the layouts to the decorations. It's hard to describe this feeling of contentment and relief of being in a place that you haven't been in a very long time. We decided to take a trip to the grocery store I used to go to. And sure enough, as we drove down nostalgic roads and into the store, I found the Pokemon bread from my memory. Of course, the Pokemon was different, but the taste and the feel of the bun was still the exact same. A few days later, we visited my other grandma. We hung out with my parents and made our way towards our old home. Reconnecting with family that I had not seen in a while grounded me, and I felt thankful that I had taken the opportunity to come back. When I first decided to return to Japan, I expected to feel a profound sense of belonging. But what I found was more complex. Going back to Japan made me realize that while I belong in this country, I also don't. I feel like I'm both Japanese and not Japanese at the same time. This duality has helped me better understand who I am and what values I hold. Being away from a place you once called home is challenging. You feel like you don't fully belong anywhere, but that unique perspective gives you an identity that not many others share. These past few weeks have shown me how unpredictable and beautiful life can be when you embrace your journey. The real happiness I found wasn't just in the unique sights or the delicious foods, but in reconnecting with my roots and discovering new facets of myself. From someone who has reconnected with their roots after many years, I hope to hear about your journeys and self-discoveries too. By Shoy.